Welcome to this Lundbeck webinar on decisions and behavior. This is one of a series of 6 webinars, and all of them are available to view on the Lundbeck Foundation website. Today we have 3 speakers. Sam Gershman is a professor of psychology and is also at the Center for Brain Science at Harvard University. His research is on cognitive neuroscience, in particular using computational approaches to study learning, memory, and decision-making. Jonathan Pillow is a professor at the Princeton Neuroscience Institute at Princeton University, and he works at the intersection of neuroscience, statistics, and machine learning, using these methods both to extract structure from high-dimensional neural data and to study how neural populations encode, decode, and process information. And our third speaker is Kenji Doya, who's a professor at the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology. Kenji's work involves theories of reinforcement learning and Bayesian inference, experiments on the cortex, basal ganglia, and neuromodulatory systems, and robotic studies of multi-agent learning and embodied evolution. Okay, so for our first speaker, Sam Gershman, will talk about policy compression and information bottleneck in action selection.
Thanks, Larry. And it's an honor to be here today in celebration of the Brain Prize. My talk is going to focus on I'm hearing an echo. My talk is going to focus on a cognitive level of abstraction primarily that I think will be useful for understanding how decision-making unfolds in the brain. And at the end of my talk, I will gesture a little bit in the direction of how I think this might work in the brain. Okay, and I'd like to just start by acknowledging my PhD student, Lucy Lai, who did a lot of the work I'm going to talk about, and also Professor Ann Collins, who shared some of her data for some of the things I'm going to talk about. Okay, so I'm going to start with 2 laws of learning. The first law of learning is well known, and it was proposed in Edward Thorndike's book, Animal Intelligence. It's the law of effect, which is very intuitive. It says basically that if you got rewarded for doing something, you will likely do it again. There's another law that Thorndike proposed, which is less well known, but perhaps equally important, and that's the law of exercise. If you did something, you will likely do it again. Okay. Now, this is puzzling, right? Law of effect seems intuitive, right? But the law of exercise seems less intuitive. Why does simply taking an action make it more likely that we will repeat it in the future? Now, classical reinforcement learning theory suggests that this is a bug, and I'm going to actually argue that it's a feature. Okay, so here's the standard sort of rational analysis. Rational in the sense that we're going to set up an optimization problem and then model biological agents as solving this optimization problem. So the setup here is that the agent has a policy, which is a mapping from states to actions, or more generally a probability distribution over actions. And for each policy, they can compute the value, which means the average reward under that policy. And their goal is to find the policy that maximizes value. Okay, so that's what the expression at the bottom says. Now, there's an additional nuance that I'm going to suggest needs to come into play, which is that the brain, and really any physical information processing device, has a capacity limit. Essentially, it has only so many bits that it can use to communicate information. And so we're going to formalize this capacity limit as an upper bound on the mutual information between states and actions. So we'll call this mutual information the policy complexity, right? It basically tells you intuitively how state-dependent your policy is going to be. Now, when you impose this constraint, something kind of interesting happens. You can actually solve for the optimal policy, and I'll show that in a moment. But let me just kind of give you the big conceptual picture. So the idea is to think about action selection as a kind of capacity-limited channel in the way that we think about other communication channels. So states are drawn from some state distribution. They're encoded by an encoder, and then the action selection is produced by decoding the appropriate action from that code word. And it turns out that the optimal policy takes the following form, which will be familiar to many people who have experience in reinforcement learning. It's essentially a variation on the softmax policy. So the optimal policy has two terms, an expected reward term, that's Q, and a marginal action probability term, which basically says that actions with high frequency of selection are going to tend to be selected more in the future. And then the balance between these two terms is determined by this coefficient beta, which I'll explain in a moment. But intuitively, it acts as the kind of inverse temperature or controlling the decision noise. All right, so we see signatures of Thorndike's two laws here, right? So the first term is a version of the law of effect. It says that if you took an action and were rewarded for it, you'll be likely to take it again. And then the second term is the law of exercise. It tells you if you took an action frequently in the past, you'll be likely to take it again in the future. Okay, and then, great, inverse temperature controls the balance between these two laws. So we can think about this by invoking a branch of information theory called rate distortion theory. I'm not going to use the language of rate and distortion, but essentially the concepts are the same. So we can think about this two-dimensional plane where the y-axis is the average reward, that's V, remember? And then on the x-axis is the policy complexity. And remember, the capacity limit is some upper bound on policy complexity. So we can think about this dashed vertical line as defining an agent's capacity. And then this blue line here represents the optimal frontier for any agent with a given capacity limit. What is the optimal reward that it can achieve given that capacity? So if the agent's capacity is over here on this dashed line, then what it wants is to produce the policy that sits on this blue line that intersects it. And then it turns out that the inverse of beta is the slope of this of the curve at this point. Okay? So higher complexity policies will tend to have larger beta. And it turns out that this reward complexity curve is always monotonic and concave. And there are other mathematical properties, which I'm not going to get into right now. Okay. Okay, so what's the evidence for a capacity limit in reinforcement learning? One comes from these studies by Ann Collins and Michael Frank, where they showed human subjects stimuli. They're just colored squares or shapes, and then they had a number of actions that they could choose from. And what they manipulated across different blocks of trials is the number of different stimuli or states in our parlance. And what they showed is that performance systematically degrades as the set size, the number of different states on a given block, increases. And that's a little bit perplexing from traditional reinforcement learning theory, where we posit essentially a lookup table of state action values that has no capacity limit. But clearly here, there's a behavioral signature of a capacity limit. And I spent some time reanalyzing these data using the tools of rate distortion theory and showing that people seem to be fairly close to the reward complexity trade-off function, that those curves that I showed you before. Although for low policy complexity, they seem to fall systematically below them. And there's another story, which I don't have time to tell you today, about why this might be happening. Okay. I've also done quantitative tests of the theory where we can construct this sort of over-parameterized model with an extra coefficient next to the marginal action probability term and fit this to behavior. And basically, the theory says that this should be close to 1, and in fact, it is. Right, so that seems to support the functional form implied by this capacity-limited reinforcement learning problem. Now, there's a bunch of interesting phenomena that are predicted by this model that go beyond perseveration. So, for example, it predicts several other interesting regularities. Stochasticity is kind of built into the optimal policy. It has predictions about response time as well as action chunking, which I don't have time to talk about. So let me just say a few things about stochasticity. So even when payoffs and probabilities are known, choices are still stochastic. This is illustrated, for example, by this classic study by Mosteller and Noji. Now, under the optimal policy, under resource constraints, you're still going to get stochastic choices, right, under the softmax policy. And when the number of states is larger, for example, if you, like in the Collins studies, you increase the number of states or you put people under higher cognitive load in some other way, stochasticity should be higher because the same resource pool is being shared across states. So I also reanalyzed the Collins data to illustrate this by plotting the conditional entropy over actions given states as a function of set size, and showing that stochasticity does increase as a function of set size. Another important regularity comes from the study of response time. So a classic law known as Hicks' law is that response time tends to increase logarithmically with the number of options. And you can see this also in the Collins contextual bandit task, where I've plotted this as a function of log set size, and you see it's pretty linear. All right, so why is this happening? Now, if you think about each code word mapping deterministically to an action, the optimal encoder is going to map states to a binary code word with length equal to negative log of P of S, negative log of the probability of that state. Now, if all states are equally probable, then the expected code length is log n, where n is the number of states. Right? So you basically recover Hicks' law as a special case of this framework. Now, but why exactly should code length predict response time? So one classic way of thinking about the decoding process is Huffman decoding, where each code word defines a sequence of yes/no questions that traverse a tree terminating in the input symbol. So the idea is that you're going to kind of follow a path through this tree by answering a sequence of yes/no questions, and then that will tell you at the end what action to take. So response time here is the time it takes to traverse the tree. If we think it's linear in code length, then we get the regularity of Hicks' law. And then there are a few interesting nuances to Hicks' law. So for example, responses should be slower for longer code lengths, even when the set size is held fixed. So it's not intrinsically about set size, it's really about code length. And that's why this sort of generalized form is something called the Hick-Hyman law. The slope of the set size function decreases with practice, and that's consistent with optimal compression arising from learning the probability. So you don't necessarily start with a fixed slope that you keep forever. And then interestingly, the set size function actually flattens out for very large set sizes, and this is consistent with the existence of a capacity limit, right? So you can't just arbitrarily increase the number of bits. Okay, so I've told you about sort of secondary analyses of other data sets and older phenomena, but my lab has also done a number of new studies to directly test policy compression. And we basically adopted the same essential structure as the task that Ann Collins developed, where each state maps to some reward maximizing action. But we've done a few additional things, like, for example, we played around with the state distribution. So we have, for example, two different conditions that vary that are identical reward functions but differ in their state distribution. So in one case, there's a flat distribution. In another case, it's biased towards one particular state. And the prediction is that you're going to see more compression when the state distribution is non-uniform. And the intuition is that an agent can exploit structure in the state distribution to reduce redundancy. And indeed, we see signatures of compression. So we see more reward, less stochasticity, and faster responses for non-uniform state distributions. We've also played around with non-uniform marginal action distributions. So the prediction here is that more compression when the marginal action distribution is non-uniform across states. And the intuition is similar, right? So you can basically exploit that structure for redundancy reduction. And again, you see more reward, less stochasticity, and faster response time for non-uniform action distributions. So the last thing I want to talk about is a hypothetical neural architecture, which we're only just now starting to kind of test the implications of this. And this grew out of a collaboration with Ben Sayovetsky's lab at Harvard, who had been, their lab had been doing lesion and electrophysiology studies of two subdivisions of the dorsal striatum, the dorsolateral and dorsomedial subdivision. And their work, as well as a lot of past work, suggests that there might be a division of labor here where the dorsolateral striatum, which is traditionally associated with habitual action, encodes something like a default policy. So this could be kind of like a generalization of the marginal action probability setup that I showed you before. And then the dorsomedial striatum learns state action values. So it's more associated traditionally with a kind of goal-directed action. And then this beta parameter might be controlled by tonic levels of dopamine. So I'm just going to right now focus on the division of labor between DLS and DMS, and not talk about tonic dopamine, although we do have some interesting results on that as well. Okay, so the hypothesis is that the dorsolateral striatum implements this default policy that acts as a kind of regularizer, biasing the control policy implemented by dorsomedial striatum towards low complexity. And this is more of a teaser than a full description of the experiment, but basically what they have found, this is mostly work by Cheshta Bhatia, who's a grad student, is that when dorsomedial striatum is lesioned, animals are left with a low complexity policy. And what this means is that basically the DMS lesioned animals exhibit a tendency to ignore stimulus cues, so they're relatively state independent when choosing actions, and this produces a pattern of reliance on this kind of default policy, including perseverative behavior. All right, and I think in the interest of time, I'll just briefly mention that we have some evidence that tonic dopamine is controlling the complexity through an estimate of average reward. The intuition is to pay more attention when reward rate is high, but without exceeding the capacity limit. You see a signature of this in reductions in effort exertion following dopamine lesions. We've analyzed a data set of Parkinson's patients doing a decision-making task on and off L-DOPA medication, which controls tonic dopamine levels. And what we find is that response time increases under L-DOPA, as well as policy complexity, consistent with the prediction that more complex encodings take longer to decode. Right? So this is generally consistent with this idea that when tonic dopamine goes up, the brain will adopt more complex policies, and that will produce a response time cost. All right, so just to wrap up, the big picture here is that any resource-limited agent has to compress their policies. And I drew out a number of implications of this. The measurable traces include patterns of perseveration, stochasticity, response time, chunking, and we're now just starting to understand the neural architecture that underlies all of these behavioral phenomena. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam. Maybe I'll start the question period and then we can go around. I'm going to ask a general question and perhaps naive question, but let me shoot it out anyway. Is this part, there seems to be a general trend to deal more with the action part of reinforcement models as opposed to the value part that I think has dominated in the past. And this kind of seems like part of that. And I'm thinking also of things like action prediction errors and like that. So one, is that correct? And if so, how do you see that continue to expand?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's really hard to think about the structure of reinforcement learning algorithms in the brain without making some assumptions or hypotheses about the policy, about the action structure. I think that one thing that has changed, well, it's interesting because there's a kind of a long history to thinking about policy optimization algorithms like actor-critic style models in the basal ganglia, but it's also interesting that there were very few efforts to actually experimentally test those models. And actually now now Cheetah's lab, for example, is starting to more systematically test these ideas. But I think that what's interesting about that kind of class of models is it puts more attention on the implications of the policy for learning algorithms, right? Because you're now trying to directly optimize a particular policy. So assumptions you make about the functional form of that policy matter a lot. And the action prediction error stuff, I think, falls into that bucket.
Okay, thanks. Jonathan, you want to ask anything?
Great. Yeah, I had a question. So Sam, I really enjoyed your talk. It's something that's puzzled me a long time. So mice, I'm going to talk in a second about some models of mouse behavior. And one of the things that they do is, as you're well aware, is to perseverate. So they keep choosing the same option, whether or not they're rewarded, which seems like a very suboptimal thing to do. So I guess my first question is perseveration the same thing as habits? Or are those different? I had the impression that maybe habits were sort of on a different time scale, or is that behavior of choosing the same option again and again, is that habit forming and perseveration, are those the same things, or do you think of those as different?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because I don't want to claim that I have sort of a monopoly on how habit is defined, but there is a kind of controversial history about how people think about habit. So you may recall that 10 or 15 years ago, people were thinking about habits in terms of something like a model-free reinforcement learning system, right? And I, of course, I also contributed to that conception. But there were a number of critiques, for example, from Kevin Miller, which basically made the point that that's probably the wrong way to think about habit, and that habit looks something more like perseveration. That it's not a product of some kind of particular value function, but actually just a tendency to repeat actions, right? And so in that sense, I think it's more convergent with this perseveration idea.
Okay, cool. I say partly because I think I got in trouble with someone for saying perseveration was habits, and they said, "Oh no, those are different." Anyway, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, there is a timescale issue there too, right? And I'm not sure if that means that we need sort of different conceptions of habits at different timescales.
Okay. So I guess my other question would just be, so there's a particular way of constraining the complexity of your policy, and I just wondered, it seems like a particular choice to say I'm going to have this trade-off between these two terms. You could have instead, I would imagine, just directly have put a complexity penalty on the policy Q, right? So just penalize the entropy, some measure of complexity of that. And would that give you similar, in other words, is that an approach that's been tried before, or would that give you similar, maybe having the action become more independent of the state would give you a habit like behavior out of just a direct penalty on Q itself? So in other words, there are other ways to get this policy complexity trade-off without kind of adding these two explicit terms that you used.
So I skipped a step in the math that would have, I think, made clear the answer to your question, which is that, right, so I started with this bounded, this sort of constrained optimization problem, right? I'm trying to optimize value subject to an upper bound on my policy complexity. But how do you get from that to this softmax policy? The way you do it is you take the Lagrangian of that optimization problem, and then you can interpret beta as a Lagrange multiplier that's weighting these two terms, right? You have a reward term, a value term, and you have a complexity term, right? And then you do some variational calculus and you get that softmax policy, right? So that's why it's very analogous to the information bottleneck method, right? It's the same essentially.
But you could have made like a sparsity penalty on your policy, right? Instead of an entropy penalty, and that would have given you also some measure of reduced complexity, which maybe would look different. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's right. And actually, I kind of glossed over this, but if you may have noticed at the end, I sort of subtly shifted from talking about this marginal action probability to some general default policy, right? And that's partly motivated by work in machine learning, like algorithms like soft actor critic, where they are not really thinking in terms like the machine learning people don't actually care about capacity limits, right? They care about regularization, and so so they're not trying to solve a constrained optimization problem in the same way, right? And so we've started to explore that perspective more, and that's where this sort of more general default policy comes from.
Nice, thank you.
Yeah, so I just settled in to the hotel. Yeah, so thank you. So does that theory carry on to continuous state, continuous action framework?
Yeah, well, I feel like I should be asking you that, Kenji. Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, so in the machine learning literature, people have developed continuous control versions of these ideas. But we haven't studied that in like a neuroscience or behavioral context. Yeah, I think it's a super interesting question.
Yeah. So then, yeah.
You want to continue a question? That's fine.
Yeah. So how we kind of interpret this like a complexity as a kind of a means for keeping the like a variability of a policy, or like a kind of a keep it free rather than being very like extremely deterministic. I think that's a very interesting point. So I have been so far taking like interpretation that such keeping like variability would be helpful for exploration. But yeah, so in some cases, this complexity can be like giving some kind of a penalty for the working on behavioral cost. Yes, I haven't thought about that way, but it's a very interesting way of thinking. But yeah.
Yeah, well, you should talk to Lucy since she's at your institute. But
Right, yeah.
But I will just say very quickly that one of the interesting things about this setup is that there's a kind of convergence of different perspectives, right? So there's the information constraint perspective. There's the regularization perspective, and then there's the exploration perspective, right? And it's interesting that they all of the same sort of solution kind of meets all of those different desiderata.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So maybe we should move on to Jonathan's talk. Our next speaker is Jonathan Pillow, and his title is Flexible Models for Unlocking the Dynamics of Animal Decision Making.
Okay. I believe can you see my slides now?
Looks good, yeah.
Okay, great. You can hear me all right? Okay, great. Let me get started then. First, let me just say thank you to the Lundbeck Foundation for organizing this seminar, and thank you to Larry for inviting me to take part. It's a great honor to be here in celebration of your phenomenal brain prize here. So I'd like to talk a bit about the work that my lab has been doing to understand animal decision making from a descriptive standpoint. So I think it's a very nice counterpoint with Sam's work. Sam's just told us about some very beautiful work trying to come up with normative principles that describe why animals make decisions the way they do. My lab tends to take the opposite approach, which is to start with data and ask if we can build statistical models that capture what it is that animals do when they make decisions. All right, so this general field is often known as perceptual decision making, where on any given trial, an animal gets a visual or some kind of sensory stimulus. It comes into the system, they integrate evidence over time perhaps, and then they render a decision. All right, and so this is a very canonical approach to studying neural circuitry and the computations that underlie both perception and action and the transformation between them. And so the goal that we often have is to come up with a concise model that would describe this transformation from sensation to action. All right, and so there's a long history in the literature of different models that describe how one might want to take this to solve this problem. So a lot of these come from the kind of normative standpoints that Sam just mentioned. Signal detection theory is a particular approach for saying if you're sensing a signal subject to some kind of noise, how do you make decisions optimally? And there's a variety of other models, either mechanistic, different forms of mechanistic models that try to achieve these kinds of normative ideals. All right, but I want to point out one problem with these classic models from signal detection theory to generalized linear models, which is that the classic models tend to assume that once an animal has been trained, that it performs the action in the same way on every trial. So there's this model mapping sensation to action or to decision on trial t-1. It's the same model on trial t, the same model on trial t+1. The animal is a machine that is mapping inputs to outputs, and we want to understand that machine. And so the focus of my talk today is to talk about two different ways that my lab has tried to push on this assumption that the model doesn't change across time. Okay, so the first part of my talk will focus on methods we've developed for characterizing continuous changes in the model. So what are the dynamics underlying trial-to-trial fluctuations or slow fluctuations across the history of learning? So part of the motivation for this is if we look at the learning curve of an animal being trained to perform a decision-making task. So this is an example mouse from the International Brain Lab. I'll talk a bit more about this data a bit later in the talk, but you can see this is every trial. It's a smooth curve of the animal's probability of getting the decision correct as a function of time. And you can see that the very start of training the animals right around 50% correct. These vertical gray lines here show you the session boundary. So every day is a different session. And over time, slowly the animal's behavior is winding its way up till it gets around 75% correct near the end of training here, right? So it slowly progresses from untrained, where it's guessing at 50% chance, to a regime where it's able to get 3/4 of the trials correct. And of course, you'll notice that it's not a monotonic increase in performance. Even within a single session, there are fluctuations where maybe early on the animal's not doing as well, and then it gets better its performance fluctuates within a single session. All right. So part of what one of the problems my lab set out to study was, can we build a descriptive model for these kinds of changes in an animal's decision-making policy that occur over time? All right, so one way to frame this problem is that we want to simply track the animal's time-varying policy as it migrates up some expected reward landscape. So you might imagine this gray surface over here shows, at the beginning of training, trial 1, the animal's sitting somewhere on the outskirts of this hill, where it's getting a very low amount of reward per trial. And by the end of training, it's somewhere near the top of this landscape where it's getting a high amount of expected reward. And so the goal of the animal, the goal of the experimenter really across training, is to drive the animal up this hill to where it's performing the task with high accuracy. All right, but the animal, as we saw, doesn't take a monotonic path up that hill. It may take some winding path illustrated by this green curve. All right, and so the first goal that I'm going to talk about is, how do we develop a model that would allow us to track the evolution of this policy? And I'm being a bit ambiguous so far about what these weights are. Think of this as some vector of weights that describe how the animal maps inputs to outputs that are changing after every trial as the animal learns the task. Okay, so our first goal is to build a model that will allow us to extract this green curve from the raw decision-making data. Okay, and so to do that, we developed a model known as SciTrack. This is the work of a brilliant grad student from my lab, Nick Roy, who's now moved on to DeepMind. And the idea is that we have the scenario at the top. On every trial, the animal gets an input vector X, and this contains, say, the stimulus plus other regressors that might influence the animal's choice, whether or not they should in an optimal sense or not. Things like the previous reward, the previous choice, that would capture things like perseveration that Sam just talked about. And then there's let's see, I'll just go ahead and show you the model. The model from X to Y is the output, the animal's binary decision, is parameterized by a Bernoulli generalized linear model. What that says is that we have a vector of weights on every trial that take a dot product with this input vector X, and the output of that dot product goes through a logistic function that gives us the probability of the animal choosing right or left. So this is a very simple model of the animal's policy, and this maps directly onto the softmax decision policy that Sam talked about in his talk, that just says these weights describe how the animal integrates evidence, and then it has this noisy decision function by which it emits an output. All right, so that describes the mapping from inputs to outputs on a single trial. But the other piece of our model is we need a description of how these weights evolve across trials. And so for this, we did something very simple, which is to assume that from trial T-1 to trial T, the change in this weight vector is a zero mean Gaussian noise vector with potentially different variances for different weights. So some of the weights in the model might evolve very rapidly. So learning is driving them very rapidly. Others might have a very small variance, which would mean that the weights could only change a very small amount from trial to trial. Okay, so that's the SciTrack model. And part of our contribution here was to develop very fast, efficient methods for fitting this to very large data sets. So data sets with tens of thousands to even hundreds of thousands of trials to be able to extract the time-varying weights of an animal across its learning. All right, and so we applied that to a data set from the International Brain Lab, which is a collection of 21 researchers studying a common decision-making task. I'll just describe to you how we set up the task. In our setting, the animal gets a set of inputs on every trial. There is a stimulus on the left with some contrast, a stimulus on the right with some contrast, and a bias, which is a constant that determines whether the animal's sort of has biased more to one side or the other in its decision-making. And the animal has to decide which side has a higher contrast, all right, and choose the side on which the stimulus is brightest. All right, and so we'll also include in the model some other regressors, such as the sign of the previous stimulus, the animal's previous choice. This would allow us to capture things like perseveration that Sam just talked about. We know animals don't just weight the stimulus on the current trial. They also tend to repeat their choices from previous trials. And the previous stimulus would give us the ability to capture strategies like win, stay, lose, switch. So if the animal pays attention to a weight on this regressor, it would choose the thing that was rewarded on the previous trial. Okay. All right, so we've applied the SciTrack model. Here's an application to a data set from an example mouse in the IBL training set. And what we can see is that the stimulus weight, the left and right stimulus weights shown here in yellow and red, slowly diverge away from zero over the course of training. And that gives rise to this time-varying accuracy plot for this animal that I already showed you on the second slide, that shows the animal began near chance performance, and then over the course of training, it gets up to around 3/4 accuracy. And we can see that the SciTrack model captures this very accurately. Of course, there's much more going on under the hood than just capturing the animal's probability of getting it correct on any trial, you can see that there are also these non-zero regressors on choice history, on reward history, and that the stimulus on the weight on the left stimulus is larger than the weight on the right stimulus. So the animal is actually going to be a little bit better on left contrast trials than on right contrast trials. The model also does a good job of capturing the animal's time-varying bias. So the bias here is calculated as how much more the animal chooses right than it should, right? So if it's zero bias, it'll choose right roughly 50% of the time. If it's got a positive bias, it'll choose right. For example, in this session over here, my mouse is not moving here. It'll choose right 19% of the time more often than it should in this session right here. All right, and once again, we see that the sidetrack model does a very good job of capturing this time-varying bias. And to be clear, it's doing that not just with this bias weight. The bias weight would be sort of an extra evidence to choose right or choose left that's independent of the stimulus, but also from an asymmetry between left stimulus weights and right stimulus weights. So this would mean the animal's biased if it gets a higher fraction of left trials correct than right trials correct. Okay, so our take home from this part, we see that we learn that the bias weight tends to fluctuate faster than the other weights. There's an asymmetric learning of left and right stimuli for this particular animal. And the animal has even after training, it still has some dependence on choice and stimulus history, all right? So the animal's not doing what you might expect an ideal observer to do, to weight just the sensory stimulus on this trial. It's also doing something like perseveration or weighting its previous choices. Okay, so the sidetrack solved this first problem that we set out to solve, which is to infer the time-varying trace of these weights parameterizing an animal's behavior over time. I want to just briefly mention two other research endeavors in this same space, but I won't describe the details. But it's sort of part of a research program to both understand and control an animal's learning of a task as it's trained to perform a new sensory decision-making task. All right, so sidetrack solved the problem of tracking time-varying decision-making behavior. The next project that we undertook, and this is some published work from Zoe Ashwood and Nick Roy, and I have some new work with a current graduate student, Victor Giada, which is still in preparation, which is instead of just assuming that these weights evolve according to a Gaussian random walk, we might imagine that the reason these weights are being driven uphill is because of some learning rule. So on every trial, in other words, between trial T and trial T+1, the weights change a little bit, partly due to sort of random fluctuations, but also because the animal got rewarded, let's say for a correct choice, or it didn't get rewarded when it made an incorrect choice. So there's some learning rule under the hood that's driving these weights uphill, and we developed methods for inferring what that learning rule is. So far we focused on a class of learning rules known as policy gradient learning rules, which just say that the animal would increase the weights in a way that would make the rewarded trials more likely, the rewards more likely. Okay, so that work has been published, and there's more on the way in that domain. Partly we want to consider more powerful models of the animal's learning, and then once we've inferred an animal's learning rule, the final step that we'd like to address with this set of work is to develop better methods for training animals. So one frustrating thing about working with these data sets is it often takes tens of sessions or sometimes multiple months to train an animal to perform a simple binary decision-making task. And so we've been wondering why this is. And one reason may be is that the training protocols that we're using are not optimal to the animal's learning rules. So the idea of an adaptive training protocol would be that if we can select stimuli optimally on any trial, this is also known as curriculum learning in the machine learning literature, perhaps we could develop a curriculum or a training policy that would allow us to move the animal's weights much more rapidly uphill. And so far we have some simulation results showing that works very well on simulated rats and mice. And we're in the process of rolling that out in collaboration with Carlos Brody's lab at Princeton to see if we can actually train animals faster. Some of the rules that emerge are things that you might expect intuitively, like start with easy trials, start with very easy examples, and then as the animal gets better, choose harder examples. But this also includes things like debiasing or training the animal not to rely on perseverative strategies, but to use the stimulus on the current trial. So to the degree that we understand the animal's learning rule, we can use that to inform our choice of the stimulus in a closed loop setting. And so that's a new direction of work that I'm also very excited about. Okay, so however, given the time limits of this talk, I'd like to now pivot to the second part, which focuses on a separate kind of internal states that we think underlie animal decision-making behavior. All right, so part one, I said that this policy that the animal is using to make decisions is evolving slowly from trial to trial in a way that over the long time course of learning would drive it from chance performance up to being a fully trained animal. But it seems possible from things that we know about animal decision making and also from our inspection of some of the raw data that there may also be more dramatic changes in an animal's policy from trial to trial than these sort of gradual changes that are captured by learning rules and by this sidetrack model. So we hypothesize that animals may also have internal states that govern their policy. So you think of these as different strategies that the animal's using to make a decision. Maybe one strategy is to rely on the stimulus, and another strategy is to perseverate, just repeat the same action that I did on the previous trial. All right, and the animal may make jumps or discrete switches between these strategies. And we'd like to develop some computational machinery for asking whether that's the case in animals performing our tasks. All right, so, and I should say part of the motivation for this work is the following puzzle. If you plot an animal psychometric curve, that's the plot of its probability of choosing a rightward option as a function of the stimulus strength. So here it's a function of how strong that stimulus is, either on the right, plus 100 would be 100% contrast stimulus on the right, minus 100 would be 100% contrast stimulus on the left. You see this animal is only getting about 90% correct, even on those very easy trials, right? This curve saturates at 90% and at 10% for leftward choices. 10% of the time it's going it's going right when it should have gone left, even on these very easiest trials. So why is that? That seems puzzling that even on the very easiest trial, the animal would suddenly decide, oh, I'm going to ignore the sensory evidence and just try the other side. This has been a puzzling phenomenon, especially in rodent research for many years. And so we hypothesize that maybe what's going on is not that the animal is unable to see the stimulus, but it's switching between different strategies. Okay, and so the way we decided to approach this problem was to formulate a model known as the GLM-HMM in the literature now. This is specifically a hidden Markov model with generalized linear model observations. Okay, I'm going to unpack that for you to describe how the model works. So the base of the model is a hidden Markov model. This is a discrete state model where on any trial, the animal can alternate between some number of discrete states. So here's an illustration of a two-state hidden Markov model. There's state 1 and state 2. And on any trial, I might remain in that state, or with some probability, I would transition to the other state. So if this A12 is very low, I would tend to remain in state 1 for many trials in a row before transitioning to state 2. On the other hand, if the transition probabilities are high, I would expect frequent transitions between the different states. Okay, so that's the hidden Markov model part. The other part of this is that each state is associated with a distinct Bernoulli generalized linear model. That's the sidetrack model that I just told you about. But here, instead of having weights that evolve continuously in time, we're saying there's a completely different set of weights for state 1 than there are for state 2. So let's say the state 1 GLM has a strong weight on the sensory stimulus, so we would get a steep psychometric curve here, whereas the state 2 GLM, let's say, maybe has a larger bias and a very shallow, small weight on the stimulus, giving us a shallow psychometric curve. So in this case, we might say that the animal in state 1 is highly engaged, it has high accuracy performance, and it's getting nearly 100% correct on these easy trials. And in state 2, it's relatively disengaged and is never getting very high accuracy. All right, so this is just a sketch of the model. There's a model developed earlier by Adam Calhoun in Malamurthy's lab that we applied to fly behavior, and we've now published a couple of papers applying this to rodent behavior. This is just a schematic of the model. Let me show you what we obtained when we fit this model to data. So we found that a 3-state model gave a very good description of mouse behavior performing that International Brain Lab task that I just told you about. The 3-state model had the following parameters. First of all, a transition matrix that describes how likely you are to transition from any state to the other. These large values along the diagonal tell you that this is a very sticky hidden Markov model. So if I'm in state 1 with probability 0.98, I'm likely to remain in state 1 in the next trial. So once I'm in a particular state, I tend to stay there for a long time. And that's true of state 2 and state 3 as well. Then we can look at what happens in each state. And here we can see that state 1 is associated with a large weight on the sensory stimulus. This delta contrast is the difference between the right and the left stimulus, and it has a very small bias. So instead of looking at these weights directly, it's sometimes a little bit easier to look at the psychometric curve that is induced by them. So here you see that state 1 with this large sensory weight and nearly 0 bias and nearly 0 weight on perseveration has this very steep psychometric curve. Whereas these other two states, state 2 and state 3, have a large left and right bias and a relatively small weight on the sensory stimulus. And so what this model says is that when we fit this model to data, the animal seems to be switching between 3 different states, a very engaged state where it's getting high accuracy performance, and 2 other states where it tends to repeat leftward choices mostly or rightward choices mostly. And so our model is telling us that this overall psychometric curve that I showed you a few slides ago, where the animal's not getting 100% correct even on easy trials, it's not because the animal can't do the task perfectly accurately on those trials. It's really because for some reason the animal's alternating between these different states. Okay, so that's the fit of the model. We can then use the model to gain more insight into what's happening within a single trial. All right, so the fitted model can now be used to infer to compute our probability, the posterior probability of what state the animal is in as a function of time. So here's an example session from one mouse back in 2019, and you can see that these are the three states again: an engaged, biased left, and biased right state. But the animal initializes this session in a very engaged state before transitioning to the biased left state, this red state here, near the end of this session. But you can see that you see different behaviors on different sessions. Here's another one where it again started out engaged and then flipped between the two biased states. Here's one where the animal in the middle of the session decided to flip to the biased state before going back to the engaged state. So one thing that I think is cool about this model is it allows us to gain new insight into what's happening on a trial-to-trial basis within a session. It's not that the animal is gradually necessarily, it's only gradually changing its policy. It's actually jumping between these very different strategies from trial to trial. And the fact that these probabilities are near one during these times tells us that we, the experimenter, can be fairly confident about what strategy the animal is using at any moment in time. Okay, so this is all for one example animal. We applied the model to a population of 29 mice from different labs in the IVL, and we found remarkably consistent states across animals. So here are the state 1 weights for 29 different animals. All of them have this pattern of a large weight on the sensory stimulus in the engaged state, and 2 other disengaged states where the sensory weight is low and the bias is either negative or positive. And we also get dwell times that are reasonably long. So around 25 trials on average is how long these animals will stay in the engaged state, slightly shorter durations, but still tens of trials, or 10 trials on average, that an animal will spend in one of these states before pivoting to another state. Okay, so that is work that we published in 2022. Since that time, we've continued to develop this model, and so one obvious extension that might occur to you as you're listening to me speak is that the first part talked about a model with continuously time-varying weights that you fit to learning data. This second part was about a discrete state switching model that we applied only to fully trained animals. And so the natural question arises, well, what's happening during training? Do these discrete states emerge early in the training process, or do we have maybe only one state during the early days of training, and then only later, once the animal's fully trained, does it start alternating between these engaged and disengaged kinds of states? So to address this question, Lenka Cucurella, who was a undergraduate researcher in my lab, who's now a PhD student at Columbia, developed a dynamic extension of the GLM-HMM. Really, this is a model that marries the sidetrack model with continuous changes in the weights of each state with the GLM-HMM. So there are multiple discrete states. So just to say that again, there are multiple discrete states, but the weights defining each state can evolve slowly across time. And when Lenka fit this model to data, she found that indeed a 3-state model provided a very good fit to the data. And moreover, that even from, and so we can see here the sensory weights and how they evolve over time. So all 3 states, we have an engaged state with a high sensory weight here, which is growing the fastest. But even these 2 biased states, the weights are growing from a 0 value at the start of training up to so non-zero value. So even when the animal's disengaged, it's still getting better than chance performance in those states. And here we see the bias weights, which are relatively unchanged across time. Maybe the bias weights grow a little bit later in training, but by and large, there's one state with near 0 bias and 2, a biased right and a biased left state. I should say each point on these plots is a different session. So here we're saying for each session, the animal has a different set of weights. And I think the most exciting finding of this work was we asked, when does this 3-state model start to describe the data better than a 1-state model? This is a histogram across mice of when that point occurs. And so you can see for all the animals we examined, by the 3rd session, a 3-state model is a better description of the animal's behavior than a 1-state model. So this says it really isn't the case that the animal has only one state at the start of training and only later starts to alternate. Even from the very beginning of the training period, animals can be identified as exhibiting 3 different strategies that they alternate between even within the course of a single session. All right, so these states emerge early in training. The stimulus weight increases in all states across training. So I should say performance during training is getting better, not just because the engaged state is getting better. All the states are getting better. The other thing that I haven't shown you on this slide is that as the animal gets trained, it learns to spend more time in the engaged state. All right, so the increase in performance that we see with training is a combination of these 2 factors, the weights changing, but also being able to remain engaged for longer periods of time. All right, so that's some new work that's in preparation, and we're hoping to release that on the archive soon. And so with that, I'd just like to wrap up. I've described SciTrack, a dynamic Bernoulli generalized linear model for tracking behavior. I briefly glossed over the idea of inferring learning rules from training data, and then using those inferred learning rules to develop adaptive stimulus selection methods for optimizing training. And then finally, in the second part, we talked about the GLM-HMM as a method for inferring discrete internal states, and now making those states dynamic so that we can infer their existence over the course of training. We have some exciting future directions, mainly involving looking at learning neural correlates of some of these states and the learning rules that underlie them. And then lastly, what I'm excited about getting going on actually applying these to asking whether we can improve animal training. So that sums up the kind of the scope of the work I wanted to talk about. I just want to thank the many students and collaborators who are a part of this work, and to thank my funding. And I'm happy to stop now for some questions.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Stop sharing.
Yeah, do you want to stop sharing? Yeah, great. No, I think you're still seeing. Yeah. So I have a question about policies. So, applying a single policy over and over in nature is probably a bad idea. So I wonder if that, I call it the law of restlessness, that there's an impetus to change policy periodically, and no matter how much you train, you can't get rid of that. So I kind of wonder if in Sam's expression, in addition to the log P, there's something else, like an entropy or something that should force these models to be a little bit more restless, a little more varied in their policy.
So that's a great question. So I would say that idea of exploration, explore-exploit trade-off is something we already have in reinforcement learning. You have ideas like epsilon greedy. I should do the best thing, except once in a while with probability epsilon, I should explore and try something else. Or that same kind of exploration comes out of softmax, this kind of softmax policy that Sam mentioned. Even though you have a policy that says there's more expected reward from this choice, I'm going to put that through a softmax function and sample a choice.
The only thing I would say is that this is not exploration, it's applying a different policy. I mean, as you just showed.
So right. So sorry. Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Was that I think what's novel here, and I should say we're not the only ones to do this. Kevin Miller at DeepMind, in collaboration with the Brody Lab and several other people, is also exploring this, so that the policy itself is switching, and it's not switching per trial. That the animal will try out a policy for some tens of trials, and within that policy, there's still this kind of maybe explore-exploit trade-off. But one policy might be tilted more towards exploration. Then for another section of 10 to 20 trials, I'll jump into another policy that's more about exploitation. So I think that's something that's fairly new that hadn't been, to my knowledge, Sam could correct me if I'm wrong, proposed in the RL literature before, that there would be this perseveration in policy. You'd stick with a policy for a while, then switch to a new policy, and you'd keep these policies around and kind of alternate between them. I should say Peter Dayan's group has also worked on some infinite extensions of these policy models where you can infer an unlimited number of policies that an animal is alternating between. So there's recent excitement about this, but I think that's a fairly new idea.
Okay, so are those transitions spontaneous or dependent on certain events? For example, like a sequence of rewards or a sequence of non-rewards?
Okay, great question, Kenji. So yeah, so the question, what happens when the animal transitions between states? Under the model as I described it to you, there is just a fixed transition matrix that says if I'm in state 1 with probability 0.98 remain in state 1, or with probability 0.02 transition to one of the other two states. So it's like a coin flip. Surely that's not what, there may be factors that drive an animal to switch states. So there's a recent postdoc in my lab, Zainab Mohammadi, who's been extending the GLM-HMM to incorporate a model of what drives transitions. So it ends up adding another kind of GLM, which says, what are the features? Maybe when the animal has gotten enough reward, it's sated. And so that drives it into one of these bias states. I'm no longer that thirsty, so I'll now just start perseverating because I'm not quite as motivated. Or maybe the animal gets, demoted. Maybe it's had a lack of reward gets it frustrated. So what are the factors that seem to drive it into the engaged state, or allow it to go into one of these bias states is also something we'd like to understand. The model as I described it doesn't have any description of that, but if we had that, then we could also imagine getting control policies that would drive an animal into the engaged state, which could also improve our experimental yield. So that's something we've talked about but haven't started working
on. Jonathan, great talk. Very interesting stuff. I was wondering how you think about the reality of discrete states here or discrete policies, right? Because I understand that in your experimental results, you show that, look, the posterior probabilities are close to 1, but I mean, that's conditional on a generative model, which assumes discrete states, right? It just seems to me that from a computational perspective, you probably need, at least in certain domains, some kind of parameterized policy that that is continuously variable, as opposed to, like, some discrete small set of discrete policies.
Great question. Yeah, so I agree with you completely. It's unlikely that there are really discrete policies in the brain. So one of my students has started working on the problem: could we train an RNN to exhibit something like state switching? So you could imagine, I guess, yeah, you could imagine that that the policies are continuous, but that they're still, are energy wells, let's say, in some continuous space that we jump between. So I guess the one question is, what does that energy surface look like? Is the animal really sort of moving continuously between these three states that I showed you, and our model is just clustering them? There's some continuum of engaged to disengaged policies, and our model is forcing a dichotomization onto them. Or is it really the case that all of those continuous policies really are more similar to the engaged state, and then there's more of a discrete jump? So I think it's a criticism that's well taken, is that this model is in some ways designed to find discrete states, and that's what it does. But to what degree is it imposing those? So I should say we have done some comparisons between a continuous model where there are a continuum of states as opposed to the discrete state. The model comparison said that this discrete switching model was a better description of behavior. That doesn't mean that there isn't some other. Presumably in the brain, things are continuous. I would sort of assert that. But finding, a neurally plausible implementation of this discrete switching is, I think, an ongoing problem that we'd like to address.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so let's move on to Kenji's talk. Our third speaker is Kenji Doya, and his title is "How Can We Build Digital Brains?"
Kenji, you're muted.
Yeah, it looks good, Kenji, but you're still muted.
Sorry. Yeah. Can you see my screen? All right. So yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity. And then first of all, congratulations, Larry and Terry and Haim, for the award of the Brain Prize. Yeah, and also I want to thank Larry for accepting our invitation to give a Brain Prize lecture in the Japanese Neuroscience Society meeting next year. Right. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about maybe three things. First, my encounter with Larry in my early career, and also stepping into the field of computational neuroscience. Because this Brain Prize is really kind of a recognition of computational neuroscience by the wider neuroscience community. And then main part is a reinforcement learning and Bayesian inference. And finally, I will talk about our recent project, so-called Brain Minds 2.0, and then within that, so-called digital brain project. Right. Okay, so the beginning of my research was to create a robot that learned to walk. And then this is a very small robot. And then it makes like a search in the 5-dimensional parameter space so that it can walk as fast as possible. So this is a kind of a very primitive form of a reinforcement learning. And while I was doing this, I became more and more interested in how animals move their bodies. And so started to look into the literature of central pattern generators. And then that drove me to the study of recurrent neural networks. So there are many studies of recurrent network. If I set a certain connection pattern, what kind of oscillation will emerge? But I started to think of a kind of inverse problem to produce certain target output, how we can set up the correction weights. And for doing that, I thought of like a network which receive a target input and produce the same output. If this learning is complete, you can make a feedback so that this network serves as an autonomous oscillator. So initially, I set those hidden unit connection weights randomly and only train the output weights, which is something today known as a kind of reservoir computing. And then later, I also derived the learning algorithm for the recurrent connections as well, with that we could train the much more complex waveforms. So that was my PhD thesis. And also I tried to apply that to the kind of reinforcement learning problem as well. And after getting my PhD, I stepped onto the more like a biological central pattern generator. So I joined the lab of Professor Alan Silverstone at UC San Diego that works on the lobster somatogastric ganglion, which is a small network which produces rhythmic output patterns. They study the property of the network and also the single neurons. So there I started to learn about like a single neuron model, like a Hodgkin-Huxley model. And this is a kind of computing graph of the Hodgkin-Huxley model. And it looks like a recurrent neural network. So then I could also show that to produce a certain output pattern, we can train such a Hodgkin-Huxley type neural model to fit the parameters like conductance, also the voltage dependence of the gating variables, and then how those parameters are kind of co-vary each other. And then I applied such a framework to actual data from the somatogastric ganglion, and then found that this certain combination of ionic currents, like A current and H current, can produce like a slow oscillation observed in the somatogastric ganglion. Right. So, and then we were doing this kind of work in the UC San Diego in the West Coast, and around the same time, Larry was working on the same system, the somatogastric ganglion, with Professor Eve Mada at Brandeis. So I visited the Brandeis and then start to know Larry was working on very interesting work. For example, how these parameters of the Hodgkin-Huxley model may adjust itself depending on the excitability of the cell. That was I was very much interested in that kind of work. And also another work I was very much interested is like a systematic model reduction. So for example, the Hodgkin-Huxley system is a 4-dimensional system, but by the conversion based on so-called experimental potential, so you can clearly see that this 4-dimensional system is actually very well approximated by the 2-dimensional system. So, and then I further thought, how can we discover such like a low-dimensional latent variable? So then I came up, so with this low-dimensional system, we can do a nice phase space analysis. And then I came up with the idea of applying a kind of an autoencoder. So based on the higher dimension observation, learn the low dimension representation. So this can be like a nonlinear transformation. And then the novelty was that these low dimension parameter variable have a specific time constant. So some of them can capture quick components, some of them capture slower components. And then with that, I could, for example, reduce a 6-dimensional system into 3-dimensional system, and then visualize how the like bursting patterns can emerge. So this is my previous work, motivated by the Larry's work. Right. So these are the very early days, the previous boom of the connectionism, but this was also the time when the computational neuroscience emerged, and also people started to apply machine learning frameworks to neuroscience data. And then since then, I came back to Japan first at the laboratory called ATL, then at my current institute at OIST, and then worked on the topics of reinforcement learning and Bayesian inference. So as many of you know, the reinforcement learning involves like a predictable reward as a value function and the action selection, for example, by like a greedy or postman selection, and then learning from the actual experience based on the temporal difference error. So how can we implement these steps and how can we tune these parameters like temporal discounting and inverse temperature or learning rate? These are very important issue in practical implementation of reinforcement learning. But we thought that these are also very important topics of neuroscience, how our brain realizes the reward prediction, action selection, and learning from the actual experience. So that was the kind of topic we have been working on. So regarding the implementation of reinforcement learning in the brain, like many people, we kind of speculate that the basal ganglia, which forms a loop circuit with the cortex and receives strong dopaminergic input, may play a very important role. And our specific hypothesis was that neurons in the striatum, the input site of the basal ganglia, may keep track of the like state value function or action value function, which is the key variables in the reinforcement learning. And to test such a hypothesis, we proposed a framework to infer the hidden variables in the brain based on the observable sensory motor variables in the form of a dynamic Bayesian inference. So this learning loop can be a state of transition in within the brain, and then based on the observation of a state, action, and the reward. So we infer the time course of the latent variable, like action values, and also the parameters of the reinforcement learning in the kind of dynamic Bayesian inference framework. So we apply this kind of framework for the animal performing a very simple, like a binary choice task. So after center hole, the rat chooses left or right hole, and then the reward probability for the left and right change over time. So he has to keep track of the goodness to left hole or goodness to right hole. And then by fitting the animal behavior to the reinforcement learning model, we can infer the change of the action value, for example, for the left choice. And then we can look for the neurons which may change its activity like this action value, and we could indeed find some of the neurons that change the activity very similar to the time course of the action values inferred from the behavior. Right? So that was one kind of evidence suggesting that neurons in the basal striatum may keep track of action value function. But my former postdoc, Makoto, further analyzed animal behavior and then also came up with an alternative model. So that is like a state of transition model. It is maybe related to what Jonathan talked about. But in this framework, we assume that the state can change trial by trial, depending on the action animal took and also the reward animal received. For example, the simplest case is so-called like win state lose switch strategy. But in some other cases, animal doesn't change the behavior in one shot after the non-reward trial, but gradually shift the state so that it can shift to the other. So and maybe this is like a more engaged state. This is a more like a easygoing state. So that kind of a state transition was also modeled based on the actual animal choice behavior. Right. So yeah, so reinforcement learning model is very helpful, but in real life, single reinforcement learning model may not explain animal behavior very well. So we may need to think of some kind of a hybrid model. And then regarding the tuning of the parameters of reinforcement learning, based on the well-established theory that dopamine encodes the temporal difference error, the key learning signal for reinforcement learning, we came up with a kind of hypothesis that different neuromodulators control different parameters of reinforcement learning. And we focused on the possible role of serotonin in temporal discounting. So we have been working on several different frameworks. More recently, we have been working on the optogenetic manipulation. So this is the task of waiting for the delayed food pellet after 3 seconds, 6 seconds, 9 seconds, infinity. So usually animal make a lot of abandoning for 9-second waiting, but with the blue light stimulation of serotonergic neurons, such like a waiting error decreased. And for infinite waiting, so animals usually abandon after 10 seconds, but with blue light stimulation of the serotonin neurons, they could wait much longer. So this is like consistent with the hypothesis that serotonin may have a role in modulating the values for the delayed reward. Right. And also, as Sam mentioned, so in the reinforcement learning framework, there is a model-free and model-based strategies. So in the model-free case, we don't assume any knowledge of the world by the agent, and then they just learn from the sequence of state action reward and state action reward. So then it's kind of a reactive framework, very simple, but the learning tends to be very slow. So in the model-based framework, agents learn the action-dependent state transition model, and then you can use that for like estimation of the current state from the past state and action, or plan ahead for the future actions. So this is predict and then act. So a deliberative process. So it can allow more flexible adaptation, but the internal computation can be heavy. So how we kind of select between these or combine these is a very interesting topic. This is one example of like a model-based reinforcement learning of bouncing up and balance of this smartphone-based robot. So during this kind of initial random trials, the robot produced a model of how the body responds to the wheel movement. And then with the offline optimization of the policy, it can learn to do this kind of a balancing behavior within less than 10 trials. This is one example of the data efficiency of a model-based framework. So when people or animal will do something like that, we can think of it as a kind of mental simulation, which we can define as a brain process using action-dependent state transition model, deterministic case or like a stochastic ones. So you can use it for like estimation of the current state from the previous action and state and action in the face of noise or delay or occlusion. We can use that for predicting the future, so finding the appropriate actions to reach the desired state. And you can apply such a process for arbitrary state for the kind of imagination or thought experiments. So the mental simulation is a very important function of the brain, starting from sensory motor control to higher cognitive functions. And then we are trying to understand the kind of a neural mechanism for mental simulation. So, and in doing so, I took the another kind of a hypothesis I previously raised, that the different parts of the brain are especially for different types of learning. For example, cerebrum for like a error-driven supervised learning, and the basal ganglia for reward-driven reinforcement learning, and cerebral cortex for like unsupervised representation learning, and also some working memory capability. So, and then the very simple model-free reinforcement learning can be implemented by linking the state and action representation in the action value function in the basal ganglia. So for the model-based action selection, it involves like a state transition model which can be probably learned in the cerebellum. And then for a given state, you come up with certain action candidate and predict the forthcoming state and evaluate the goodness of such a state by the value function. And if it is good enough, you can actually execute. Otherwise, you can come up with another action candidate. So this is a kind of complex procedure. But once you find out the right action for a given state, you don't need to repeat this computation. You can just memorize such a state to action mapping, which may be regarded as a kind of habitual action. So, for example, some other part of the cerebellum may add such a state to action mapping. Right? And then to test such a possibility, we performed like a functional MRI experiments in which subjects learn the action-dependent state transition model of the cursor and use that to navigate to the desired target. In some cases, you have to find this kind of zigzag pathway. So this kind of path is rather difficult to find by just a random trial and error. But once you have such action-dependent state transition model, people can find this kind of path more efficiently. And then we have had behavior evidence that pre-start delay time, subjects can benefit from this kind of action-dependent pre-learned transition model. And then during that time, we found higher activities of the part of the cerebral cortex and also the part of the cerebellum and the basal ganglia connected to these cortical areas. So our interpretation is that the cerebral cortex provides some kind of working memory, and then the cerebellum is used for the prediction of the result of the action, and the basal ganglia is used for the evaluation of the such a predicted imaginary actions. Okay, so and these are examples of the work to trying to understand the neural basis of a simple-based reinforcement learning and also model-based prediction. And we use like a Bayesian inference for understanding the current state and also reinforcement learning to produce actions. But these two are very well related. So for example, the Rudolf Kalman derived the optimal filtering known as the Kalman filtering. He realized the equation used for such optimal filtering is very similar to the equation used for optimal control, which was derived by Richard Feynman several years ago. So this similarity of the computation for inference and computation control was known as a duality of inference control, known as a kind of beauty of a control theory. But recently, the machine learning researchers found a more like a important meaningful relationship between the two. Right? So for the sensory inference, we use Bayesian inference. So in that case, we keep track of the posterior distribution. So starting from the initial guess, the state transition gives you the prediction that is combined with the sensory observation to update the posterior. That's a computation that is repeated. So in the reinforcement learning, the important computation is the value function, which is constrained by the goal state, and then state transition model and action cost defines the value function of the previous state, and such kind of computation can be repeated. So such a similarity will allow kind of a translation of the algorithm for Bayesian inference for the sake of reinforcement learning. This is known as the framework of a control as inference. For example, the famous method like a soft after critic was based on such a relationship. So this duality or relationship between Bayesian inference and the reinforcement learning is a very practically important. But I think this is also a very interesting relationship for the neuroscience, because the posterior half of the neocortex is mostly involved in sensory processing, and the anterior half of the neocortex is mostly involved in the motor control and action planning. So, and then if the two computation totally separate, there's no reason that same anatomical architecture can be used. So probably the similar six-layer structure may be used for sensory inference and motor control based on the similarity of the computation of the Bayesian inference and optimal control. So that will give us some kind of a clue for hint how we can understand the computation of the sensory and motor cortex in a unified way. And to test such hypothesis, we are starting like a multi-layer calcium imaging of the mouse sensory cortex and also the motor cortex. So it is still in ongoing work, but we could show that there are some kind of different coding of the like expected sensory input and actual sensory input. So in this level playing task, the deep layer neurons, larger proportion was involved in the prediction, and also the after action, the superficial layer neurons encoded more like actual sensory inputs. So we are further moving on to clarify the difference of representation of the different variables in the cortical layers and also the dynamic relationship between those neurons in different layers and the different cortical areas. And finally, so our new brain project, Japan has been pushing forward this brain project called Brain Minds in the last 10 years. Until the March this year, focusing on the brain of the marmoset. And then the last year, so next came up with advisory committee for Next came up with a proposal to start a new project called now called Brain Minds 2. And then the important feature of this project is that based on the technology development and also studies of psychiatric and neurodegenerative disorders, all those data should be brought together in the form of digital brain, and that will be used for clinical translation. And then earlier this year, the Riken Center for Brain Science was selected as a core organization, and that 97 India projects were accepted, and now they are up and running. So we are in the team of this digital brain development. So and then the aim of the digital brain is bind together different types of data, like anatomical data or physiological and behavioral data, and then bridge together the data from multiple species, and then build a model of the brain. The key challenge is to implement the data-driven model building. There are different data from experiments or literature or like Friday models, and we want to combine those data to produce the model, and then produce simulation codes to run the simulation. And then we want to combine that. We already have such a tool called a spiking network neural network builder. And we are hoping to combine that with some kind of a optimization loop so that this model building can be more automatized, and also we can trace back the feature of the model based on the original data and the previous models. Okay, so this is quite a challenging project, and then to achieve this, we should establish a good international collaboration. We are already talking with different brain projects around the world, and also probably utilization of the machine learning framework, both as a normative models of the brain, and also for the tools for data-driven model building. That is very important. And also in Japan, we are producing an original data set for the marmoset. We hope to utilize such a data as much as possible. and then to promote understanding and then also international collaboration. We are running a so-called digital brain seminar series. Okay, right. So I hope to collaborate with a lot of people around the world to discuss how to view the digital brain and how to utilize it. Okay, yeah, thank you for your attention, and I would like to thank my collaborators for this kind of projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kenji. Your talk to me raised the question of memory. So, the classic reinforcement model to me is kind of memory minimal, but you can go all the way to retrospective models that are very memory intensive. And you describe models kind of in the middle, your multi-state model and things like that. So, do you think the reinforcement model is too minimal for memory? And how much memory should we put into these ideas?
Yeah, so recently the people at DeepMind discovered that the use of the like a memory buffer is very helpful in making reinforcement learning more stable when combined with deep neural network. And that also raised interest in the function of the, for example, hippocampus to provide episodic memory. So in some cases, looking back of the actual history of what happened after what state and what action is very, very helpful. But compiling such experience into like a action-dependent state transition model may also be helpful for various use, for example, like a planning or the inference of the current state. So I think the use of the episodic memory and the use of the state transition model also have the benefits. And I think the brain would be equipped with both kinds of mechanisms. So my speculation is that the hippocampus system will form more episodic memory, and then the cerebellum would be for deterministic transition model, and the cortical network would be more suitable for probabilistic transition models. So yeah, I think those may be combined in a flexible way. But how they are combined in a flexible way, that is still a very open problem in neuroscience. So when we perform functional MRI experiments, we see this part of the brain and this part of the brain are activated, so they are involved in a particular function. But how they can be appropriately activated and connected, that still is a very open question we have to address seriously in the forthcoming years.
Great. I'd love to ask about the states in your description. Are they? It's assumed a finite that the states map onto the states of the environment, or what's the number of states? What determines that? And then also, what is the neural representation of those states in your setting?
Yeah. So when we perform animal experiments, we try to make it simple. So the number of states are like just discrete and then a few. But in the realistic case, we have to deal with continuous sensory observation, and then even infer the latent state behind them. Right. So in my work so far, I try to make things simple. So to assume the discrete state and the discrete actions in most of my neuroscience research. But yes, so how to extract behaviorally meaningful latent variable latent state from a high dimension noisy sensory observation, that is a very important issue I haven't addressed in the research topic I presented today, but I'm also very much interested in that topic.
Kenji, thanks for the broad perspective given by your talk. And I just wanted to say that the division of labor between these different hyperparameters was very influential for a lot of people, including me, earlier in my career. And I wanted to ask you kind of the big picture question of how you feel like that division of labor has stood the test of time, right? Because we now know a lot more and things seem more complicated, right? But at the same time, there must be some kernel of truth there as well, right?
Yeah, so probably that captured one aspect of those neuromodulators. For example, we have been focusing on the serotonergic system, but the serotonin itself may do something more than just temporal discounting, right? So the one aspect I'm interested in is how to connect between model-free system and model-based systems, right? So model-based systems require more computation, but in some cases it allows a more flexible adaptation. So the serotonin may also have a role in selecting between model-free and model-based system. And our preliminary work with mice suggests that serotonin may indeed promote like model-based processing rather than model-free processing. So then this framework of serotonin needs to be kind of extended. So my current working hypothesis is that serotonin may be related to how much time you have for learning and decision. The more time you have, you may spend time for like a model-based versus model-free decision for more thinking time. And also with that, you may be able to predict longer into the future. Right? So, but that still may be too simple to capture the wide variety of the effect that serotonin has. So, but I think at least such kind of a aspect captures some part of the function of the neuromodulatory system.
Thanks.
So maybe we can move into the general discussion. One thing we had talked about is discussing different kind of philosophies and approaches to modeling, theory-driven models, data-driven models. I think we should throw into the mix more mechanistic models. All of this has come up here today. Maybe I'll just quickly throw out some simple-minded definitions, but feel free to make it more sophisticated, just so people listening in will know. So I think of theory-driven, a good example is having an optimization principle and saying, well, if you want to do this task optimally, this is the way to do it, and then see if animals are doing that and see what that implies about the animals, blah, blah, blah. Data-driven is, Jonathan provided a good example. You take the data, you fit let's say a GLM to it, and you infer and you move up. And mechanistic is really getting down to the neurons and the synapses, who's firing who, etc. So they're very different approaches, and we thought we would just discuss their virtues and when you should use one, when you should use the other, and just open it up. And I thought maybe you could start, Sam, with the ideas of the theory-driven models.
Sure. I actually, this is really semantic, but I think of theory-driven models in a less restrictive way than I think you've defined it. So I think of a theory-driven model as any, in the context of neuroscience, any model of how the system works, right, at some level of abstraction, right? So and typically, that's grounded in some kind of computation, right? So, and I want to distinguish that from sort of statistical descriptions of data, right? I don't think that there's actually a hard line between these, right? Because like as Jonathan's talk illustrates well how this is kind of blurry, right? Like you could have, whenever you build a statistical model, you're gonna incorporate some assumptions or hypotheses about, for example, what the psychometric function looks like, and that's going to be based on certain principles, like, as the contrast increases, the animal is going to become more accurate. So it's sort of, these are two kind of poles along a continuum, as opposed to a hard boundary. So I think that, so just to put my cards on the table, what I'm going to say is probably not going to be controversial for this group of people, but I do feel like there is an attitude in general within particularly systems neuroscience that basically what we should be doing is collecting as much data as we can and developing increasingly sophisticated analytical methods for extracting structure from those data sets, right? And then once we have that structure in hand, then it'll be the job of the theorist to sort of like look at that structure and write down the computational model that captures that structure. Right? And that has succeeded in some places. However, I'm pretty skeptical that that kind of workflow is going to be successful in the long term, because I think that, first of all, there's an experimental design issue. Like, I think you're not just kind of going to stumble into appropriate experimental tests of non-trivial theories. And then the other thing is that, and I think this is maybe the point where we can have more of a discussion, is that the construction of statistical models has to start from some assumptions about what kind of structure you're looking for, right? And if you start from very seemingly innocuous assumptions, then you're not going to actually learn anything from the data. So the challenge that I would put is basically that if you look at a lot of the work that's been done on constructing statistical models of neural data, for example, what you ultimately get at the end of the day is like, here are some bunch of latent components. This component seems to respond to choices, and this component seems to respond to rewards or stimulus or whatever, right? And then we're kind of back at square one, because we didn't actually discover anything new from that exercise. We essentially discovered some latent variables that map onto things we already know. And I think that's what theory brings to the table, is that it introduces new kinds of computational variables or processes that we can then look for using statistical methods. That's kind of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, maybe let me make a comment. The thing I worry about, you broadened the definition from mine, that's fine. But if it's too general, there's the problem of uniqueness. I mean, these days, if you want to build a model that does anything, you just throw AI at it, right? You already know, for at least a huge range of things, it's going to work. The question is, is that going to be in the same class as an animal solving that task? Or is it too general?
Yeah, well, I have thoughts about that I want to let others speak.
Yeah, okay. So go.
Yes, I would take issue. I mean, I don't know, Sam. I feel like you're wanting to have. I think your definition of theoretical model would encompass every kind of model, including you said it has some equation. I don't remember exactly what you said. It has some description of something. I guess I might have, instead of theoretical models, I might have said normative models, maybe, as opposed to the distinction between normative and descriptive models. Where normative models often start with the sort of, how would I design an agent to solve this problem? So let's say I need to detect a signal in noise. And so I'm going to make a description of what that looks like. I would have in certain simple cases, this is signal detection theory. I have a criterion, I get a measurement that's noisy. Every time that measurement is above the criterion, I'm going to choose right. Every time it's below that criterion, I'm going to choose left. All right, so that's motivated from a consideration of like the statistics of the problem that an agent faces. You write that down, and then you go and look for, can we find a neuron that responds, when it's above, can we find evidence of that in the brain? Now, of course, these levels should talk to each other, but I think that's quite different than approaches that might start by saying, let's record some neurons during decision making and ask if we can build a statistical model of what they're doing. And maybe that we can map it back onto this ideal observer model or some kind of normative model. I do think it's, it's interesting to find those connections. But I do think they're different, I guess.
Yeah, but can I just say that I think I didn't communicate myself clearly. So the reason I'm resistant to restricting it to normative models is that I think the same kind of reasoning or distinctions apply in domains where the normative component is kind of irrelevant. Like, let's just talk about physics, for example, right? We can, and we have, Larry is trained as a physicist, right? So he can jump in here, right? But the way that I'm thinking about this is that we can write down physical laws that are, like, when we talk about physical theory, right, we're not just talking about sort of arbitrary parameterized equations where we fit the parameters, right? We're deriving them from a set of principles. And you could take so I want to contrast that with a kind of machine learning approach where you like I give you a bunch of videos of billiard balls bouncing around, and you fit like a recurrent neural network to that, and you try to recover something like you recover the dynamics in contrast to something like building in constructing a model based on Newtonian mechanics, for example, right? Which is what I would think of as a classical physical theory, right? It's not normative, though.
Fine, but in both cases, I guess you cooked up a model. Yeah, you then think that's how this system works, and then you go look for it in, you see whether that theory. Basically, it's hypothesis-driven research versus I would say maybe data-driven research. I have a theory that I write down the Bellman equation. I can see that gives me a way to train an agent to quantify how an agent should learn, and then I go and see that these particular dopamine neurons respond in a way that seems to be the some term in that equation, and so a lot of work has had that flavor, and I guess other work has had. I guess those theories, I think, have worked really well in physics, and they haven't worked very well in neuroscience. So I guess it seems like in neuroscience, what we need is much more attention to how the brain actually works. That we're not going to cook up the laws of physics by thinking about the laws of, let's say, we're not going to cook up the laws of the brain by thinking about how computation should be solved.
Yeah, I guess we disagree there, but I don't know. Maybe Kenji has
Yeah, so I want to utilize whatever constraint or hint we can use, right? So brain is like a biophysical system. The each neuron doesn't know what it's doing in the whole brain. It's just a receiver input and then produce a spike and then change the synaptic connection weights. But still, the entire system is serving for the survival and reproduction of the animal. That has been done in an energy efficient and the data efficient way. So that will give us a constraint how the entire brain should be working. So I want to utilize such constraints for the survival and reproduction, and the constraints for the mechanical implementation of the brain by the neurons and the synapses, and also all the observations about the neurons and the behavior. So so far we have constructed like a normative models like reinforcement learning or Bayesian inference, and try to fit the model with the behavioral data. So in other case, we came up with like a mechanistic model based on the brain anatomy or biophysics, and try to fit that with the experimental data. But I think consistently combining these three different constraints, like a normative and the mechanistic, and also observe the data. So that is something I'm hoping to formulate, so that we can do it in a more kind of consistent way. Right? So that is one of the wild dream we are thinking about doing in this like a digital brain project.
there's kind of a new beast in the game, which is these foundation models. And it sounds like the Japanese brain project thing that you described, Kenji, is essentially a foundation model for marmosets. Is that right? And that strikes me as yet another approach.
Yeah, so further we can really make like a foundation model of the brain so that it can morph into a marmoset brain or human brain. That is the question. But at least we want to utilize the data from the different species to be translated to help building, for example, human brain. So which is a very important target for our clinical applications. Yeah. Yeah, probably we would build brain models for like a mice and a marmoset and humans separately, but they should be linked so that basic processing in the neuron or local circuit level may be quite similar.
Yeah, I guess it'll be interesting to see what happens with foundation models there. I guess I'm coming back to Sam's point. I mean, I like let's point to sort of particular area. How about vision science or even computer vision? For many years was dominated by the idea that we would come up with these, how do you infer shape from shading, or how do you connect? You can detect edges, and then you take those detected edges and you can make surfaces. You're going to come up with principles of how to solve the vision problem, and that failed, right? So I think it's unequivocal at this point that computer vision didn't ever come up with some theoretical principles of how you would solve vision. Instead, they got lots of data and they trained it end to end, and now we can do object recognition. I think is arguably a solved problem at this point. And that may not, maybe we can go and take those models and still interpret them and find, features of the theories that people put forth. Maybe there is some kind of shape from shading layer in there, but that wasn't the way that led to, it wasn't the theories of computer vision that led to the current breakthroughs that we have in the ability to understand either how to recognize objects or how to predict what neurons in the visual system of the primate brain are doing during, our best models of those neurons are regressing against the internal units of these giant models that we don't really understand from a theoretical perspective. So I guess the question would be, and in some ways I feel like there's if it happens this way, I'll be disappointed. If the foundation models just allow us to predict whatever, every part of the brain does through some giant transformer, then where are we as that will say that we didn't need the theories that we've been developing, perhaps, or maybe the more hopeful version was we can then take those theoretical models and interpret them in terms of theoretical principles. But either way, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how you feel about foundation models. I guess I'd be curious for both of your thoughts.
I mean, I feel like there's a sort of reductio ad absurdum here, where if the quest is to build as quantitatively a predictive model as you can, then you're going to move towards bigger and bigger, more complex models with more and more training data. You'll be able to capture more variance in the brain data, and then at the end you will be left with something that's sort of like a slightly less complicated version of the brain, and it just seems like that's at odds with the classical explanatory project of science. Right now that's not to say that there's no use for that, right? Like Kenji already pointed to the fact that if you have such a model, right, now you can do all sorts of clinical translational work because you don't have to run experiments on people and things like that, right? But I just think we can't lose sight of the fact that that you either have to accept that there's some that explanation is a goal in of itself in science, not just that's distinct from prediction, or abandon explanation and just say that what science is kind of fundamentally different. And I would just say one last thing about this, which is that with the vision example, right? I think that we have to, even if you want to adhere to an explanatory model of science, the nature of your explanations needs to change over time, right? The history of science shows us that how we explain things changes over time. What kinds of explanations we think are good or satisfying change over time. And so I think the shift or one of the shifts that we've seen is that the kind of explanation we were looking for is some kind of like, the sort of principles like shape from shading that Jonathan was talking about before. And then when we have these models like convolutional neural networks as a model of the ventral visual stream, the nature of the explanation is different, right? It's not necessarily going to be located in the sort of mechanistic structure of the models, but rather in the architectural choices, the training diet, and the learning algorithms, and so on, right?
Well, and maybe since you opened the door for me on physics, physics is often given as a model, and it's very successful, but it is not a single description of the world by any means, right? You go from quantum field theories, quantum mechanics, classical mechanics, statistical mechanics, thermodynamics, that's a huge range of ideas with very, very rough bumps on the boundaries between them, especially between the quantum world and the classical world. So it's a patch together of things, and nobody would look at a car engine and say, let's do quantum mechanics, In the same way, I think we shouldn't look at a human brain and say, well, I'm going to model that like I modeled the fly brain. I don't think that's ever going to happen. I think we just have to accept multiple models, and that there's friction whenever there's multiple models, and that's really quite intense in physics.
Right. So currently, the transformer-based foundation models have show a very remarkable performance, but that is based on a huge data for training. So which is somewhat different from how our brain is developed. Right. So, but still, the fact that transformer architecture can scale well with large heterogeneous data gives us some motivation for us to study why that is possible. And then what I'm hoping is that by understanding how the transformers work, we can extract the kind of a architecture which allows scalable learning, which may give us some hint about how to analyze or understand the complex network we found in the actual brain. Right? And then hope or dream is that by understanding the theory of a transformer, we can come up with a kind of a more like a small network that can still scale well. So that and it is more like closer to the actual architecture of the brain. So we can tell if that is possible or not, but that is a direction I'm very much interested in.
Yeah, so maybe we'll wind up unless anybody has the last word of wisdom. It wasn't planned this way, but I do fly work. I think the four of us really exemplify the whole range here of modeling things. We're still friends, right? And I think certainly all of you are making great progress. So I want to thank you for wonderful talks, a great discussion, and wish you all the best.
Yeah, thank you so much. And
it's very exciting to see.
So
I think different work informs other work at other levels, and so it's really wonderful to be in contact with different levels of description and different efforts to tie these things together.
Very good.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.